I think the thing about these services in Kubernetes is that they provide, again, this abstraction layer. And if there's any theme for Kubernetes in general, it's the idea that abstraction is a really powerful tool. And I guess that's true for computer science in general. Abstraction has always been our tool to isolate ourselves from complexity and enable us to be able to move applications forward. Hi, I'm Brendan Burns, Kubernetes co-founder and corporate vice president at Microsoft Azure. I'm going to talk to you today about the intersection of the Kubernetes open source project and Azure Compute. Here's a brief agenda for the talk. First, we're going to go over Kubernetes. I know probably everyone has heard of Kubernetes, but some of you may not have had an experience to dive into it in any detail. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what it's about. Talk about how we take that Kubernetes project and turn it into a service on Microsoft Azure. How we think about open source community and how Azure gives back to the Kubernetes open source community, and then finally conclude with a discussion of Kubernetes in China. So here's a quick overview. I think it's first important to set the context of containers in the history of computing. And I think that oftentimes people think of containers as being a relatively new phenomenon because they're something that they may have only heard of 3, 4, 5 years ago. But the truth is that containers have been around for quite a long time, stretching back to the initial implementation of chroot in BSD Unix in the 1970s. Really, most modern applications, if you're for either reliability or scale, are distributed systems that are built up of many different pieces. And so that's where Kubernetes comes in. Kubernetes builds on top of these sort of developer-focused features in containers to provide an API that's oriented around building services, around building things that have replication, that have multiple different things communicating with each other. In Kubernetes, the fundamental concepts are the service, which is effectively a load balancer for directing traffic to a variety of different groups of containers, and the pod, which is a group of containers that are co-scheduled onto the same machine, operating together in a symbiotic fashion to deliver sort of one piece of an application, right? So a service is there to provide a generic interface to a collection of pods that implement the application. But of course, it's not just about running containers and having traffic get load balanced to them. Another really important part of building any application is understanding how do I go from version 1 to version 2 of my application, and that's where deployment comes in. So the deployment is sort of the third important concept within Kubernetes, and a deployment basically is responsible for keeping track of not just a collection of pods, but actually moving those pods from a version 1 to a version 2, and doing that rollout while paying attention to the health of the application, seeing if there's a crash, moving slowly from one version to the next to ensure that you can do a rollout without any downtime that your users might see. Another way of looking at the Kubernetes API server, though, is that it's an abstraction layer on top of infrastructure. So while those developer-oriented concepts are great for building and describing an application that you're deploying out into the cloud or on-premise, the Kubernetes API server also allows you to have a more generic and more unified view of your infrastructure, whether it's running in Azure, an on-premise data center, some other public cloud. If you build applications against the Kubernetes API, you're building applications that are inherently more portable, and you're building using tools that can describe and deploy your application into all of these environments at the same time, despite differences in the underlying hardware. Of course, the more you use data services and other kinds of pieces that are cloud specific, you're going to run into challenges in portability. And so I really think of the portability promises of Kubernetes not as being a perfect, absolutely you can lift and shift an application in a day, but rather that the people and the processes that you're developing for deploying and managing your applications, those skills are transferable, whether they're deploying that application on-premise, at the edge, or up into the cloud. I think the other piece of Kubernetes is that it is really oriented around enabling DevOps. Right? And I think we've all had this experience that a two-pizza team is a sort of famous phrase that you should always build teams that could be fed by 2 pizzas. It's a real focus on keeping the size of teams in sort of the 6 to 8 person range. And the reason for this is obvious. It's because above 6 or 8 people, the amount of communication overhead that you have for keeping the team in sync, for understanding what everyone's doing, becomes really kind of expensive. And so if you can focus on having smaller teams, you can build more efficient processes. The challenge of this, of course, is that it requires that you have decoupled services. For any real large application, you're going to need to have hundreds or thousands of developers working together. If you really want to have a collection of these 2 pizza teams, you're going to need to have a way of having a lot of people work together while still staying relatively separate. And Kubernetes really helps makes this decoupling easier. And the reason for this is because all of those services, right? All of those services, they can really provide the gateway to describing a thing that each team can own. So every single service, and this is why sort of microservices has become this popular key phrase, every single team can have 1 or 2 or 3 services that they deliver into Kubernetes. Maybe a team is delivering the edge, maybe a team is delivering the middleware service, maybe a team is delivering a backend. And because they've been abstracted away from each other, and because they're each deploying these containers that can land on the same machine but not interfere with each other, you stand a real chance of being able to simultaneously have large teams working on a big, large-scale application while still keeping the actual team sizes down to that ideal 2 pizza team. I think the thing about these services in Kubernetes is that they provide, again, this abstraction layer. And if there's any theme for Kubernetes in general, it's the idea that abstraction is a really powerful tool. And I guess that's true for computer science in general. Abstraction has always been our tool to isolate ourselves from complexity and enable us to be able to move applications forward. When people think about a service, they don't actually have to think about what's behind that service. And so that means that consumers of your service don't have to worry about if you're scaling or auto-scaling, if you're doing version upgrades, if you have failures in your application. The service abstraction has hidden all those concepts from them so that they can just focus on talking to the APIs that your service is providing. I think the most important thing about this is it doesn't just decouple the design of your system, it actually decouples the operations of your system as well. And so we can actually think of separating out the operations of an application into separate people and separate teams who manage hardware, and it's uniform hardware. It's all the same no matter what application is running on it. An operating system operations team, and it is the operating system with Kubernetes can be made exactly the same for every single application that you run. Cluster operations, which focuses on just running the Kubernetes cluster and providing Kubernetes as a service. And then finally, your application operations people. Similarly, with regions around the world, Azure delivers the most Kubernetes in any managed cloud. And finally, we really focus also on being enterprise ready, ensuring that no matter what the requirements are of your company and your enterprise, Kubernetes can rise to that, and the Azure Kubernetes service specifically can provide an enterprise grade, enterprise ready by default implementation of Kubernetes. So let's take a look a little bit deeper at what this means. We saw this picture earlier of the Kubernetes API server providing an abstraction on top of machines. Well, in the Azure Managed Service, the API server itself is delivered by Azure. You don't see or pay for any of the machines or compute associated with that API server. It's delivered as a service for you. But of course, many times those machines need to be running services that are available to the customer in their own network, in their corporate private network. And so the machines themselves, where your applications actually run, they live in your private network. They live in a space that you control and that you can link up with VPN or VPC or whatever the tooling is that you need in order to manage those computers inside the same network as the rest of your company. That's where those applications are running. And so that balance of us taking care of the API server, but the workload actually running in your space really means that we can deliver a good management experience, but also you can easily build applications that meet the requirements of your company. But from a customer perspective, this is the real experience, that you're happy experiencing the Kubernetes API without really worrying about the stuff that lies below. right? And that is a dramatic simplification versus having to run all of your own infrastructure from the cluster on down to the hardware. Right? So we really make it easy for you to build the applications that work, but with a managed service. Whether you're deploying an application to the United States, to China, to Europe, to Africa, Australia, or really anywhere in between, we have more regions and will have more regions of Kubernetes available to you than anyone else. And that's an important part, not just of scaling your cluster within a region, but actually being able to scale your application around the globe. And we started an open source project in response to that customer need. That turned into this open source project called Gatekeeper within the confines of the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, or CNCF. And then we also took that project and turned it into a part of our Azure product. So it's not just to take and create a project that's source code out on GitHub. It's actually to take that source code and bring it back into our product as a supported feature, as something that you can, wake my engineers up for if it's not working correctly, as a thing that you can absolutely rely on as part of the product, not just an open source project that you happen to download from GitHub and run. It's an incredibly important trajectory from a customer need to an open source project to an Azure product to a happy customer on the other side. And we repeat this pattern over and over again in all of the sort of open source work that we do in the Kubernetes community. And that leads us to the interactions between Azure and the Kubernetes community, how we think about building innovation and contributing back to not just Kubernetes, but actually to other open source projects that run on top of Kubernetes. I want to start out by talking about why we contribute in the first place. We could just take this open source project, we could manage it for you, we could deploy it, make a service out of it, and never contribute a single line of code back. And in fact, there are clouds that do precisely that. But from my perspective, first of all, that's not being a good community citizen. That's not being respectful of the time and energy and devotion that people have poured into these communities. But more importantly, it's also not a really good way to deliver a service, to deliver a product. If you're not involved in the community, if you don't have people who deeply understand how the project is built, where the bugs are, where the bugs need to be fixed, you don't have the ability to deliver a product based on an open source project that a customer will want to use. Right? You have to be deeply ingrained in the community in order to have enough understanding to be able to deliver it reliably, to have the ability to land code, to either to add features that customers need or to fix bugs that they are facing. And you're simply not going to have the connections into that community to find out when there are things like security problems or the best practices that a customer needs to deploy their own application on top of Kubernetes. And so for all of these reasons, for altruistic sense that we have a responsibility to help these communities move forward, all the way through to the fact that I know that it makes it possible for me to deliver a better managed Kubernetes experience. Those are all of the reasons why we contribute back to the Kubernetes community. One of the places we really like to contribute is in innovation. It's a great example of how we contribute innovation to not just benefit our Azure customers, but truly to benefit Kubernetes customers across the world. We also think a lot about building tools on top of Kubernetes. Now, I also want to talk about how we think about cloud native leadership, right? Because it's not just about contributing innovation. It's not just about building tools. It's actually also about helping these communities move forward, right? And we have a number of people who have deep technical experience with Kubernetes and with cloud native technologies. And we feel a responsibility to use that knowledge and use that insight to help these communities at a technical level and at a leadership level move forward. We have people on the technical oversight committee for the CNCF. We have people on the governing board for both the CNCF and the Linux Foundation. We have people who were amongst the original founders and designers of the Kubernetes governance. Right? So the people who actually designed and delivered the ideas of how Kubernetes is going to be governed and will be governed going forward. So I think it shows that we not just contributing code, not just contributing innovation, but contributing leadership to these communities, helping these communities move forward. And speaking of helping these communities move forward, it's critically important that we also do community service. We also do the work that actually literally day to day helps these communities operate. This includes things like, helping with the Kubernetes release, being release lead for the Kubernetes project. It's a truly thankless task. It's a bunch of hard work, but without it, we wouldn't be able to release software. Kubernetes wouldn't have new releases if it weren't for the people standing up to become release leads. We've had people on my teams lead Kubernetes SIGs, be involved with the CNCF SIGs, and then also our great field folks all around the world focusing on building out and delivering Kubernetes and cloud native meetups so that we can do that sort of grassroots discussions with local people who are working on solving these problems in their own environment. And it's a really great resource, not just for connecting with those people, but actually for bringing features back to the Azure Kubernetes service so that we understand what do we need to build in order to help make these people productive and happy. And then finally, thinking about teaching and education, right? One of the things I really love to do is actually do talks like this and help people learn more about Kubernetes. Done a whole bunch of work with Microsoft to deliver talks on YouTube, as well as with a bunch of our great field engineers to deliver a best practices book. And so if you're looking out there for cloud native education, Microsoft and Azure has the expertise to help deliver those materials in a variety of formats to make sure that you, as you're going through your digital transformation, you have access to the right kinds of education, the right kinds of materials to help upskill your workers as they make a transition maybe from some more legacy development up through cloud native development. Now I wanted to talk about the Azure Kubernetes service in China, right? So I think that speaking of going to the local and speaking of delivering tools that are important for people where they are, we really have focused the Azure Kubernetes service on delivering a service in China. And that's for a variety of different companies, from national companies within China itself to multinational companies like Starbucks, who are delivering products into China as well as the rest of the world. We know that the Azure Kubernetes service is enabling those people to drive success. So taking a look at a couple of those, here's some examples of the way in which the Azure Kubernetes service is growing in China, as well as a couple of our really great partners. Daimler is a great example of a multinational company, and an example of a local Chinese company that is finding extreme success as they've deployed and started using managed Kubernetes on Azure. And with that, I'm in conclusion, and I want to say thank you so much for listening. I hope it was enjoyable, and have a great day.